Are our universities national security threats that are right now, in this moment, producing enemies of the state? Why? Because they cease to be citadels of learning, sites of wisdom, and repositories of the truth, and have become cults. Indoctrination cults that turn our students into American-hating Marxist communist foot soldiers whose goal is to rebrand America into a cauldron of pure evil. How is this done? By eradicating human beings as we know them? And what is this new phenomenon known as the transhumans, based on a philosophy of transhumanism? Why are blue-collar workers, men who lift and heave and fix the dirty, messy aspects of Western civilization, more likely to save Western civilization and American civilization than university professors? If we were to achieve a renaissance, a new beginning, who are the philosophers of the past most likely to restore honor, grandeur, exaltation, rigor, and a proper role-based society for the future? Finally, why are colleges so expensive, and how did they become hedge funds and professional sports franchises with students affixed to claim non-profit status? In the words of one writer, I and my guests will discuss these and many more questions on culture and education. This is The Jason Hill Show, and I am Jason Hill. My guest today is Dr. Michael Robillard. Dr. Robillard is a philosopher. He is the author of several books, including Outsourcing Duty, and most recently, the book that we are going to discuss today, a very, very exciting and controversial book called Don't Go to College, A Case for Revolution. Dr. Robillard is an independent scholar and an Iraq War veteran who has held academic appointments at Notre Dame, Oxford, and the U.S. Naval Academy. His previous writings have focused on civil-military relations, veterans issues, the ethics of automated technology, and free speech in academia. He's a Roman Catholic, an American, a devout patriot, and he hails from South Shore, Massachusetts. Dr. Robillard, welcome to the show.
Yeah, thank you for having me here. Really appreciate it, Jason.
It's my pleasure. I really enjoyed the book. I read it twice, and I've been reading a lot of books on, the college revolution and the case for either why not going to college is a good idea, or more importantly, how to sort of fix the educational system. But your position is a very, very different one. You're advising people to sort of start a revolution by not going to college. Let me first ask you, not many people know about the origins of the university. And one of the things I really appreciated about your book was that you went into the history of the university. It gives us a sort of understanding of how far we've moved from the mission statement of the first university as it existed. So when was the first university started? What was, and in your view, remains the proper function of a university?
Right. So, we obviously have precursors to the university system coming up through ancient Greece with the Academy of Plato and Aristotle's Lyceum that followed. And then that model eventually became largely the foundation for Catholic medieval monks, the universitas, to teach Christian Aristotelianism, mainly to aristocrats and to the professional elite class of the culture, and to inform them in really notions of metaphysics, epistemology, and ethics, and the formation of Aristotelian character. So that was the proper function of the classical university system, and that became the foundation for the European university system, and then the architecture that America took over as well.
So when you talk about Christian Aristotelianism, I think back to the symbolism at graduation ceremonies when we don medieval robes that sort of tie us to a monastic past, and we perform the role of almost, I would say, secular priests, not just as passive disseminators of knowledge, but as cultivators of something heroic, exalted, and refined. I'd like you to speak a little bit because it will really shed light on how far we've fallen in terms of the proper role of a university. I wonder if you could talk about the role historical of the university, not just as dispassionately and objectively disseminating knowledge, but as the cultivator of character, of the concept of the heroic, of an institution that continued as an institution ensconced in a polity, in a demos, in a state, the continued socialization of the individual, the role that the university played in that person, in the individual's life.
Yeah, certainly. I mean, the original role of the university scholar was very much that of a steward, of knowledge and of culture and of cultivation of these ideas, and you can almost imagine, like the passing down of this very fragile flame from one generation to another, and that idea and that set of values being able to permeate to the professional class to then coordinate a polity. So Samuel Huntington has the four main divisions of clergy, profession of arms, law, and medicine as the canonical professional classes. But these would have all been coordinated under a worldview, a Christian Aristotelian worldview that then would permeate an entire polity. And there would be a reciprocal relationship between the scholars and those who they taught, and a real sense of civic duty and relationship to the polity that they're a part of.
Right. This relationship of civic duty to the polity that one is part of is a role that the university played. And I wonder if you could point to some sort of historical antecedent that started the disillusion of that role that the university played vis-a-vis the individual. What were some of the historical antecedents that sort of turned the university from bastions of learning and the cultivation of character and into what today is our cults of woke supremacy and indoctrination centers? If you could sort of ostensibly point us to some of these historical moments, either philosophically, if it had to do with a sort of moment in the history of philosophy, or I'm thinking sometimes with the collapse of the culture spheres. What are your thoughts on that?
So I think there's several major departure points. One narrative or one explanatory story that I think has some plausibility is the one popularized now probably mostly by folks like Peter Boghossian or James Lindsay or Jordan Peterson. And the argument pretty much goes like this. It says, well, the communist Marxists didn't get the revolution that they wanted in America and in Western civilization. And because of that, Gramsci and the Frankfurt School and various disaffected neo-Marxists refit Marxism into being not a narrative of the bourgeoisie versus the proletariat, but rather oppressor versus oppressed. And this ideology seeped into the institutions. This is Gramsci's long march through the institutions, so to speak, with the express purposes of really targeting the institution of academia in particular, most prominently in the 60s. And then since then, we've inherited 3 generations of increasingly potent versions of neo-Marxism that have trickled through the universities, turning the university into a place rather than it being a stewardship location of knowledge and wisdom and cultivation of character, but rather a factory of revolution and radical subversion. So that's the short version of how we got to the present moment. On my view and Timothy Gordon's view, my co-author, since we're both Catholics and Aristotomists, our view is that the fissure in the dam actually happened a lot further back and can actually be located really with the beginning of the Enlightenment and the removal of Aristotle from the Western mind and the Western worldview. In particular, the removal of the idea of final causality or telos. So once that is removed from nature and one's own conception of self as having a nature, one small error iterated over many generations can take us to where we presently are. So those are the two major points that we locate within the arc of the university system that we think have brought us to the present moment.
Well, let me ask you. Let me follow up with a question here, because if telos is removed, but reason, so some semblance of reason, is still kept alive in the Enlightenment, is it the case that then that reason sort of just doesn't have a terminal point, an end point to affix itself to? And if that's the case, why are you then not an Hegelian? Because Hegel certainly was an advocate of reason, and certainly did think that there was a telos to which all human beings strove towards. I mean, the endpoint was ultimately spirit, culminated in the magnificent creation of a state. But all throughout history and the various iterations of historical epochs, we find that that spirit is moving towards an evolutionary development. And we find that in Christianity, there is the highest development of spirit. So are you a Hegelian? And if so, did Hegel in some sense contribute or detract from the Enlightenment project?
So I'd say I'm not a Hegelian, and I do agree with your point there. Is that telos wasn't so much eradicated, but it's been moved on certain views. So whereas on the Aristotomist view, telos was baked into and built into the nature of the human person itself, and into nature that we could read off and apprehend off of the world as we saw it. You do see in Hegel, and then later on in Marx, and really any Whig interpretation of history, any progress narrative, you do see a grand telos that gets reimagined into the background of this unfolding of history, or this unfolding of human development. I think that is correct in saying that in certain schools of thought post Enlightenment, that there is a rebuilding in of telos, but it is not of the same kind as the Aristotomist account of telos. It's more of a writ large telos that's built into history as opposed to in natural kinds themselves.
I see. All right, we're going to get back to this when we sort of round out and talk about the reformulation of what a new curriculum would look like. When we talk about an Aristotelian Thomistic reframing. For now, I want to sort of get to the more radical aspect of your book. For some time, I and others have been advocating defunding and completely shutting down the universities, because, as I said, you've agreed that they're bastions of indoctrination, but the idea of pathogens spread even to the private universities, as you know. If we had an administration that truly defunded all the universities, even the private ones that are beneficiaries of funding, would this truly have a lasting effect? Dr. Robillard, what is going short of people still not going your row, which is not going to college, we'll have some time to talk about. Once government schools exist and private institutions that are recipients of government funding exist, and people stake their aspirational identities on attending colleges and still think that social mobility is affixed to colleges. Um, what lasting effect will defunding and in some sense communicating to alumni that their dollars must have conditionals affixed to them, that is, if they're going to give money to universities, they must stipulate something like intellectual diversity so that conservative viewpoints get heard. Will these ameliorative measures really, really have an effect? Or are we just so corrupt? Has the university become so corrupt that not even defunding would have an effect on the sort of what I call the ideopathogens that are running amok in our universities today?
So I'll, I'll I'll answer that question by quoting an idea from the philosopher John Searle, and he has this idea in the construction of social reality. He has this notion of a social fact or a social object. So like a physical object would be something like a shirt, and the more I use that physical object, the more it degrades. A social object would be something like currency. So the more I use it, the stronger it gets. So a physical object and a social object, they operate almost inversely with respect to use. So the issue is a type of social object or a social practice or a social institution like currency is something like a university or a government or a bank or whatever. And the problem that we face now, I think, is that, as you said, the university system has become so corrupt that by granting further legitimacy to it, to that social object, to that set of social practices and social institutions, all we are doing is strengthening it. So trying to fight battles, so to speak, on the enemy's turf, by granting legitimacy to this larger project, to this larger institution, it's a trading of tactical wins for strategic defeats. So our view is to starve the thing entirely and start over. Start with parallelism and grassroots schooling and alternative Aristotomist institutions, independent of this entire corrupt structure.
All right, I want to talk a little bit more about the tactical wins for a strategical defeat. We're going to take a short break here. We're talking to Dr. Michael Robillard. He's the author of Don't Go to College, A Case for Revolution, a book that you should get on Amazon and purchase right away. You're listening to The Jason Hill Show, and I'm Jason Hill, and we'll be back very, very shortly. Welcome back to the show. This is Jason Hill, and we're talking to Dr. Michael Robillard, author of Don't Go to College, A Case for Revolution. When you talk about defunding and fighting, I get your point that you talked about tactical wins for strategical defeat. That's really just sort of like fighting lice in a vacuum, isn't it? It's sort of just a short-term strategy. So my follow-up question to that, Dr. Robillard, is, and I'm interested in hearing whether you think that these statistics are true, that if 65% of jobs require a college education, as we're told in the media, I don't know what to think of that. If 65% of jobs require a college education, people buy into that. How difficult is it for us to achieve the revolution And it's a laudable revolution that you're asking for by copying by dropping, by not going to college, by starting a new template, so to speak, for earning a living, for not just earning a living, as you so eloquently state, but for also educating oneself in ways outside the college realm. First of all, do you buy into the idea that 65% of jobs require a college education?
Uh, Probably not. If anyone checks out Dave Ramsey's documentary on the college loan crisis, the title of it's escaping me right now, but it's a really great documentary. He does a really good breakdown how in the 80s it was the News and Report, a weekly News and Report magazine, or the U.S. News and Report magazine, began doing their 100 top colleges list. And what this ended up doing was creating an arms race of colleges trying to vie for that status. And really a generation of a lot of propaganda and false statistics. And these very overly egregious claims about job security being guaranteed if you had a college education from these various schools. So I think there's been a lot of incentive for those statistics to be blown up and exaggerated as a way to generate both the carrot and the stick to get students to enroll. So that's the first thing. Secondly, I think we need to consider the difference between what it is to have a job and what it is to be a flourishing human being and to live in a flourishing society. And I think sometimes we can get our means and our ends flipped around. Jobs, for the most part, are a means. And if it turns out that those means are radically at cross purposes with the ends of human flourishing, then we need to consider maybe finding different means to get to that flourishing, and that might mean reconsidering different jobs or returning to jobs of old that have a tried and true track record of producing flourishing persons and flourishing societies.
Well, you talk quite a bit about that, which was very impressive because I have always been an advocate of trade schools, having seen the suffering that so many of my male students go through whose brains really are in their hands and they're brilliant. And I watch them in class. Philosophy, they're interested in the philosophy of various thinkers, but they're like most men. They're problem solvers. They fix things, and I've often thought, and I've said to them privately in the confines of my office, that a trade school is where you really begin. The problem that they've said to me is that they cannot disambiguate their parents from the expectations of upward mobility and this myth of trade school that there is this. Their parents are possessed of certain sensibilities on the order of going to a trade school is a blue collar endeavor and it's a sort of form of slumming down socially. And although my child might earn a better living than getting a degree in marketing, which will equip him to be nothing more than a floor manager at Walmart, better yet to have that pedigree degree than to attend trade school. So I guess my question is, how do we break through this kind of false consciousness? This kind of, I don't like to use the word bourgeois because it has a negative connotation. It doesn't always, when bourgeois values are actually American values. But this kind of false consciousness that parents have, which they sort of impose on their children who, young men especially, who really, really are dying to just get under the hood of a car. And fix things. How do we break this mindset that seems to possess the sense of, that seems to be the formation of the sensibilities of so many Americans that upward mobility is inextricably tied to attending college.
Yeah, yeah. I think you're absolutely right. It really is a false stigma that has existed at least from since I've been alive. I remember growing up, they gutted all of the trades out of our high school and replaced it with computer classes in anticipation for the gig economy that was on the way. So myself, I never got to really know how to be competent in these perennial things that my father and my grandfather and his father just grew up being just around. I mean, fortunately, within the military, I got like the military version of that in terms of like weapons training and jumping onto planes. So I'm not totally incompetent with my hands, but it's definitely um, something that I think myself and a vast majority of men within my generation and onward have found really missing in their soul and missing in their sense of competency and confidence in the world. You know, when you are alienated from the environment that you're in and the technology that you depend upon, it can be very enfeebling and emasculating to think, well, if any of this breaks, I have no, I don't have the slightest clue as to how to begin to fix it. Um, but I think we are seeing a revival of this ethic of seeing the value of blue collar hands on work with folks like Mike Rowe and Dirty Jobs really trying to push that ethic, and likewise Matthew B. Crawford's shop class of Soulcraft. He makes an excellent account or an excellent argument for why knowledge in the hands and physical competency really is a great feature of intelligence as well as cultivation of character.
That's really great to hear because and I like to think that there is going to be just an organic revolution among these young men who are living under what I call a gynocentric paradigm, which is a ultra radical feminist far left wing paradigm that is attempting to crush the the manliness, not just masculinity, but the manliness of boys and young men, and that somehow the revolution, the impulses. That's why we're seeing so much anger and frustration among men. I largely think that this kind of centric paradigm is going to see an expiration date very soon. And because soul, I think, and I think you might agree with me, is yearning for vitality and for vitalistic expression. Um, I wanted to sort of segue into not just the crisis of masculinity that is precipitating um, this the crisis in masculinity that I think, in some sense, is a result of the demonization of blue collar work and a symptom of passive, feckless men that we see sitting in college classrooms who are just bored to death. But it's coupled with what I call victim studies or revolutionary studies. You know, it first started in the 1960s with Black studies, and then gender and women studies, LGBTQ studies, and then Chicana studies. These studies were not scholastic studies. They were activists and advocacy programs. And you seem to think that this leads to something called the creation of a transhuman. And before we get into another topic, which I want to talk about, which is wokeism in the sciences, how are you linking these what I would call victim studies into something called the transhuman? I found that to be a most, without giving away too much again, so that our readers are not disincentivized from buying your book. What is a transhuman really, and how are these studies briefly contributing to the creation of a transhuman?
So transhumanism, it finds its, as far as I could locate it, it finds some of its earlier expressions in the writings of Julian Huxley, who Aldous Huxley's brother, and ended up being the head leader of UNESCO. He wrote a book called New Bottles for New Wine, arguing that what we needed essentially was this new paradigm of a merger of technology to radically change the essence of the human being to this totally new paradigm, almost in a Nietzschean sort of way. And that has taken on new versions in the contemporary academic sphere, in the form of folks like Ray Kurzweil, who wrote The Singularity is Near, arguing that minds and machines and AI and robotics are going to create this digital utopianism, the singularity of technology, and we'll be able to upload our minds into some kind of digital oversoul and live forever. You see it likewise with folks like Nick Bostrom at the Future of Humanities Institute at Oxford, arguing for radical life extension and things like this. Mind-machine pairing of various degrees, genetics. These are all elements of the transhumanist movement. And then on the other side of things, you see the transgenderist movement, which and the LGBT plus, whatever the plus is supposed to be the placeholder for. And this too is challenging or trying to transcend or break down the notion of an essential human nature. So while these things do kind of come apart in distinct ways, where the transhumanists are very much rational scientists or ascribers to scientism, the LGBT folks are radical postmodernists, but they do find common cause in this radical rejection and almost desire to transcend or to break down the idea of human nature. So they do link arms in weird ways in those capacities.
I see. Understood. We're going to take another short break. And when we come back, I want to know a little bit, and I want our listeners to know a little bit about just who is Michael Robillard. Why did you leave academia? And to talk a little bit about wokeism in sciences. How do we? That's a big issue, because people who want to be doctors and scientists have got to go to university. So what do you say to those people? We'll be back in a moment. This is Jason Hill, and I'm speaking with Michael Robillard, who is the author of, among other books, Don't Go to College, A Case for Revolution. Welcome back to the show. Dr. Robillard, can you tell us a little bit, just who is Dr. Robillard? Where are you from? Where were you born? What got you into philosophy? And briefly, why did you leave academia? I was very touched by your story.
Yeah, thank you. Appreciate that. Basically grew up in a blue-collar Irish Catholic home just south of Boston, small town called Whitman. And my dad was a blue-collar worker. And the area that I was from, it was very much kind of your old school labor left, a lot of, big fans of JFK, that kind of Democrat area in Massachusetts. I ended up going to the military academy when I was 17 and a half, as a combination of various reasons, I guess, combination of economic pressures and this this insistence that I had to go to college, as well as I would say, a patriotic commitment to wanting to live up to some of those ideals that my grandfathers and my father lived. They were all in the military, so there's somewhat of that heritage in my thinking as well. And went to the military academy as a devout Catholic, and encountered philosophy and just the ideas of Hume and Russell and Nietzsche, and this whole host of ideas that I had never been exposed to. It just completely just opened up my worldview, and it was like being Neo in the Matrix. And I thought, wow, this is amazing. This is what real inquiry involves. This is Socrates is the the unexamined life is not worth living. So at the time, as I'm at West Point and I'm learning to be an officer, I'm also learning more philosophy, and these things were kind of at cross purposes somewhat. Being a philosopher and a military decision maker are kind of in tension. You don't want somebody who's asking too many questions on a battlefield. In any event, I was very interested in just war theory and what the justifications ought to be for collective violence. And, so anyways, I graduated in 2002. 9/11 had happened my, beginning of my senior year. I go to Ranger School and do all this stuff, and suddenly we're in Iraq. And I'm like, I thought we were supposed to be in Afghanistan. Why are we in Iraq now? Go through that tour, that was pretty existentially jarring, largely because the overlap between the battle space and the civilian space. There's a lot of things to manage. And then upon return, everyone's talking about that there really were no WMDs in Iraq, or this specious justification for it. And I'm thinking, well, what have I just done? What have I just participated in? Have I just participated in an unjust war? So in any event, I thought long and hard about that. And then meanwhile, philosophy was still growing more and more in my interests. So I got out in 2007 and decided to become a professional philosopher. Went to University of Victoria and then University of Connecticut. Got my degree, my PhD in 2016, and got a job at University of Oxford in 2017. And at about this time, I was a center-left liberal. I thought the folks on the right were evil. They were responsible for, racism and religiously motivated foreign policy. And, I wanted nothing to do with they were the bad guys. And then I ran into the transgender movement and decided to try to talk about some of the philosophical problems with it at Oxford. And I was told by several of my peers that I shouldn't. I was highly, highly discouraged from doing so, and that suddenly hidden that was hidden the edge of the video game, and I decided I need to rethink my starting points. So I quit Oxford in 2019, moved back home, and ended up going back to church, reconverting back to Catholicism, and really just started my life over at 39 outside of academia.
Wow. So it didn't really take you that long. I've been a professor for 25 years, and I've been going through the grist and the abuse and the torture. It didn't take you that long. You're not much of a masochist as I am, it seems. But for me, just to have a sort of conversation here for a little bit, for me, it was more like, a vocational calling that I felt and that I still feel. I mean, I do have a lawsuit against my university, which is not a secret. But for me, it was a vocational calling that from God, that I just thought I can't give up. I have to remain in the classroom. I imagine I could leave one day. But I completely understand the lid on your curiosity and on your questioning mind, and how that would have affected your ability to remain as a true thinker within an institution, when your cohorts are telling you that you cannot question orthodoxy or received wisdom.
Yeah, that was it was really really jarring because I had never said I had never voiced any heterodox opinions. I had never stepped outside of the boundaries of the Overton window, so I never knew that fence was there. Then the second I crossed it, then it was a gestalt shift. You know, the background became the foreground, and suddenly I started to see what all the conservative critiques were getting at, whether it was Buckley or Horowitz or Ben Shapiro or Thomas Sowell. Like suddenly, I found myself on the outside of the discourse, and I'm like, this is what they've been so angry about. I didn't see it, you know, because I'd crossed no boundaries, so I had no reason to think there was any boundary there.
Yes, some people need to be hit over the head twice before they see that 2 + 2 = 4. But you saw the signs and the trends very quickly. The thing that bothers me so much about academia is not the fact that the humanities have fallen to the wayside, because the signs have been there for a very, very long time. When I was in 1987, when I became an undergraduate, I could see the signs. You know, what um, Jesse Jackson was leading a cohort of people saying, "Oh, Western Civ has got to go." And I remember saying, "God, give me at least 24 years after I get my PhD to have a good run in the academy," and I have. But it's the sciences, and you talk about this. You talk about scientism, and you talk about wokeism in the sciences, including now math being racist. More specifically, I wonder, for those heartbreaking students who are not part of the woke supremacy and who have nothing but a love of learning for its own sake, who want to go to college and are now going to be faced with this kind of woke ideology, which is suffusing the sciences. First, Dr. Robillard, how bad is wokeism in science, and what advice do you give to those students who are might be listening or will read a transcript of this show, who are going to be faced with the woke supremacists in the hard sciences, in mathematics now?
Right. Yeah. So there's, I think, a really a false assumption that exists within the conservative ecosystem that they believe that STEM and the hard scientists, by virtue of what they are inherently immune to politicization and to woke subversion. But I think that this is clearly not the case. If we look at any of the atrocities within the 20th century, whether it be Nazi Germany or Maoist China or Soviet Russia, the sciences became very quickly co-opted and handmade into political ideology in all of those regimes. So it's just factually false that objective science or mathematics even is going to be immune to politicization. I mean, historically, that just hasn't been the case. Second of all, within the present college milieu, you see increasing instances of, and we list them in the book, of a priori logicians and mathematicians coming out and saying that a priori logic and math are downstream from race and colonialism and maleness, which, by the way, are a priori logical claims. So, you know, good luck untying that knot. Nonetheless, you see the same thing in the sciences, where you have a lot of folks coming out and saying that science is just a social construction of you know, white male, the white male patriarchy. Yeah, these will be the same people that say we must trust the COVID biomedical data. And then likewise in the computer and tech spaces, saw this with James Damore at Google, where he just said, well, it looks like we just have more males in coding and the computer sciences, and he got drug over the coals and was forced to resign, or he got sacked. So even though that was in Google, I'd imagine there are other instances of that on college campuses in the computing technology space. In addition to these instances within those domains, another point needs to be made, and it's the following: is that even if these spaces at a particular college are relatively robust and they haven't been subverted just yet, the point is that if you go to college as a STEM major, you're nonetheless not a STEM major when you're in your dorm, or when you're in the food court, or when you're in your various other social interactions. So if the baseline of the college itself, if the cultural waters of the college that the STEM departments are in are radically woke, then that's going to rub off on STEM majors nonetheless, and it's going to cow them in subtle ways and prevent them from saying true things when it's needed. So that should be something that folks seriously consider as well, where the major itself might not be corrupted, but the ecosystem in which you locate the major on that campus, it's immersed within a woke ideology, and that's not nothing.
Right. So I'm teaching two classes now. I have 79 students in between those two classes. There are any number of students who are going into the STEM fields, and not all of them are woke. Not all of them are far left wing kooks. What do I what when they come into my office and for office hours, and some of them talk privately, what do I say to them? What would you say to them? They have clearly, this is not a case where if they wanted to be a philosophy major, I could say, well, there are no jobs, and I can show you a number of sites, and I could point you to Dr. Robillard's book, and there are any number of sources that you can educate yourself, philosophically speaking, that would far surpass any kind of the syllabus of any progressive professor. But what would you say to someone who has to go to college to become a biologist or a chemist in order to, as a precondition for going to medical school?
I would say that that there is no neutral, really. That at any given moment, you're either strengthening the muscle of courage or you're strengthening the muscle of cowardice. And the more one remains silent and complicit and says, well, I will stand up when X happens, right? Then what the danger of that is that they can forego that existential decision point of standing up and speaking truth for the rest of their lives. Like, there will always be a reason to not stand up and to remain silent and complicit and to go along with the herd. For that reason, for some people might be, well, until I get the grade, until I finish the semester, until I graduate, until I'm done with the internship, until I get the job, until I make the TT, the tenure track job, until I get tenure, until I get department head, until I get emeritus status, until I get distinguished whatever status. So there's always a reason to delay or to forego saying what one truly believes or questioning the orthodoxy in one's life. And it's just going to repeat itself at each level and each rung of the structure. So if one is a complicit, cowardly student now, then they're going to be a complicit, cowardly student intern, and likewise all the way up the chain. So I think it's a it's a muscle that shouldn't be strengthened. It's a muscle that needs to atrophy, and people need to strengthen the muscle of courage and speaking up more often at whatever role they happen to find themselves in. If they know something to be true, speak up.
That's what that you're really talking about personal accountability, aren't you? Because I think that this is something that one has to have a sort of fire in the belly uh, feeling about. When I was in graduate school, I was teaching all sorts of unorthodox thinkers that would be considered politically incorrect, and no one could stop me. And I guess one has to be willing to bear the consequences and have the courage of one's convictions. Is that what you're saying, right? You sort of you have to be courageous, and you have to be an individualist, and you have to stand up for the courage of your convictions. No one can really give you an algorithm or a formula for that.
Yeah,
Yes.
certainly. And I would point people to read either Solzhenitsyn's a wonderful essay, "Live Not by Lies," or Václav Havel's "Power of the Powerless." Either of those things, I think, can help uh, muster that fire in the belly, and those are good resources to lean on. Um, just a caveat on that: I think it's also it's false for people to think that it's going to be a happily ever after if they just stay silent and complicit. If you look at the writings of Niemoller or Bonhoeffer or Arendt's Banality of Evil, the people who remained complicit and silent, they were able to live a comfortable life for a while, but then eventually they end up getting eaten by the machine themselves. They just end up getting eaten as a coward. So the point being is that remaining silent and complicit, that's not even a guarantee that one's going to live a comfortable and safe life. And if history repeats itself, or at least rhymes, then in all likelihood, those people aren't going to live a happy and comfortable life either way.
I totally agree with you. I couldn't agree more. And part of me suspects, Dr. Robillard, that the sense in which people are complicit in being silent rests on some sense in which they themselves harbor, to some extent, anti-American sentiments, or they're bought into the canard that America is, a mean-spirited, intrinsically racist, bigoted country. They may not hate America, but they may feel guilty for loving their country. So it might be in reverse. They may feel a sort of shame for being an apologist for American exceptionalism. And so the sort of courage that would be summoned up if one did not buy into that kind of malarkey, that is, America is a bad country. So what I think what one has to do is maybe sort of provide people what I would call moral vaccines or inoculants against this kind of Americophobia that college students face. And because I'm a little bit sympathetic to young people who are, not everyone is a spiritual giant, and these are young people whose minds are developing. And I wonder what you think about the idea of first inoculating them through conversations such as we're having. That is, do not buy into this notion of Americophobia. America is a great country. Um, to the extent that we do have government schools, which is unfortunate, K through 12, that there ought to be some kind of rational, patriotic love of country that's being taught instead of critical race theory. So that by the time people who think they have to go to college, like future doctors and so on and so forth, they do have this kind of inoculation that equips them to have that fire in the belly to fight the wokeism that they invariably will face in the classroom.
Yeah, yeah. I guess the first thought or first idea I would try to communicate to young folks listening when they're faced with these charges that America or Western civilization more broadly is evil, or incurs some sort of secular original sin that needs to be atoned for. The knee jerk response needs to be compared to what? Western civilization compared to what? America compared to what? Show me what counterfactual world that things are better. Show me some other civilizational project or some other country where things are better. So, there's a lot of cherry picking of the sins of the past of conquest of Western civilization or of America, but show me any social project that didn't have the identical origins. And that's nobody seems to be concerned about Comanche imperialism or the imperialism of the Ashanti Empire. It's metaphysical and moral cherry picking to think that colonialism of Western civilization or America has some sort of metaphysical or moral valence that's special to it, that warrants its undoing, that other social projects that have the identical origins don't. So unbuckle everything or unbuckle nothing. So that's the first thing, is just to point out the lopsided set of moral standards by which we're judging civilizations. And second of all, it seems like what wokeism and all of these public displays of how much one hates their their own country and their own heritage and origins, it almost functions identically to a kind of secular religion. So where in the Catholic tradition you have private confession before a priest, if one rejects that, now you have public confession of one's secular sins on Twitter. And it seems to function psychologically in a very similar way. Of now I've washed my hands of my secular sin. I'm one of the good people, and now I'm allowed to have a voice.
Well said. Well said. Before we go, I have one final question for you. It doesn't seem it to any reasonable mind and any perceiving mind. And Aristotle was one of the philosophers that thought that our perceptive faculty was actually infallible. The judgments that we sort of formed based on those perceptions are what got us into trouble. So it seems to me that we are in a cultural war, and the purpose of war really seems to be to vanquish one's enemy. So for those young people out there who realize that we're in a culture war, and I love your statement. I wrote it down: tactical wins for strategical defeat. It's gone into my intellectual ammunition file. Dr. Robillard, if we're to vanquish the enemy, what is the each person who's a possessor, a sovereign, autonomous possessor of his or her character, what is the one action or the one trait that must be possessed in order to truly vanquish this enemy and achieve this revolution that you so wonderfully explicate in your book?
Stop lying. Stop lying and stop tolerating lies. That's what it comes down to. It's particularly it's the complicity in lies. So people need to not just speak truth, but when they hear falsehoods, when they hear lies, they just don't remain silent. Don't bite your tongue. Speak up and correct it, because that's how we got here. It's being silent while you're hearing overt falsehoods. So speak up and correct those. Do not tacitly and complicitly go along with lies.
Dr. Robillard, it's been an absolute pleasure talking to you. We're going to have you back to talk about your other book, which I'm outsourcing due to, which I'm in the middle of reading. This has been a wonderful conversation. I hope you enjoyed it as much as I do. Before we go, I know our listeners can get your book on Amazon, but where can they find you? Do you have a website where they can follow you also on Twitter?
Yep. So on Twitter, I'm at RobillardDR, and it's RoBillard, and my website is michaelrobillard.com, and you can also find most of my writings on Substack. That's where most of my writings are located now.
All right. Well, best of luck with the book, and we'll see you again soon.
Awesome. Thank you very much.
Jason Hill Show is a project of the David Horowitz Freedom Center and Front Page Magazine. Unauthorized reproduction of this podcast without express written consent is prohibited.